So good evening to you all, council members. It's good to see you all, and also to our assistant town clerk and others that we'll recognize a little later on. And for those of you who may be joining us by other media types, we welcome you as well. As you will note, tonight's meeting is not a regular council meeting, but it is a council work session. As most of you know, council has one of these usually each month, and so that's what we will be attending to tonight. So we will forego some of our opening items that we sometimes do and really just jump right on into the meeting this evening. And so we will begin by asking our town clerk to call the roll.
Hey, Mayor Marshburn.
I am present.
Mayor Pro Tem Behringer.
Here.
Councilmember Dellinger.
Here.
Councilmember Matthews.
Here.
Councilmember Vance.
Here.
And Councilmember Singleton.
Here.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ashley. I appreciate that. The next item is simply the adoption of the agenda. We have a number of items on the agenda tonight, mostly discussion and report items, and then some reports a little later on. I'm not aware of any presentations that I'll ask about later. But at any rate, Council, are you ready to adopt the agenda? And if so, I'll entertain a motion to that effect.
Mr. Mayor, I move that we adopt the agenda.
Second.
Okay, thank you both, Mr. Vance and Mr. Matthews with the second. I believe we will do our voting again by roll call at this time. So, Ms. Ashley, if you will call the roll on approval of the agenda.
Councilmember Singleton.
Aye.
Councilmember Vance.
Aye.
Councilmember Matthews.
Aye.
Councilmember Dellinger.
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Behringer.
Aye.
Mayor Marshburn.
Okay. Yeah, I will say aye as well. We have some special guests with us this evening, but I'll see if maybe our planning director may want to introduce those folks. Perhaps all of our planning commission members are with us. I'm not sure, but he will let us know. So we will now go to item D on the agenda, unless there are any presentations that I'm not aware of. And Ms. Ashley, you're not aware of any, are you?
No, sir, not at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. All right. So the first item of business tonight, there are 4 items under discussion and reports. All of this very important information and lots of it to cover. So let's jump right into it. And so I'm going to recognize Mr. Triesenberg, our planning director, and he will recognize our first folks here. Do you want to recognize any planning commission members at this time, Jeff, or just wait till the next item? Doesn't matter to me.
Sure, I can just real quickly. I know I see on the line, I just did a quick scan. I know Ms. Gina Avent is in attendance and Ms. Vira Hogan is also in attendance. And I would imagine that some others, if I'm either missing them or maybe joining us shortly due to the 6 o'clock start time, they may be just a few minutes behind schedule. But yes, good evening, Mr. Mayor and council members. We do have for your first item tonight the second joint planning commission town council work session for the UDO rewrite project. And tonight we will be reviewing with you the draft amendments thus far for the topics in Articles 4 through 6 currently. I will note that as we get further along into the recodification of things, this will largely result in a new Article 4 and 5, with most of what is in Article 6 being absorbed into those previous 2 articles, just for clarification. In the past, there's a lot of stuff that's in Article 6 that's really good. It kind of seems to work as a catch-all sort of article, and sometimes we forget where those things are located as a result. So we're trying to put those regulations in other parts of the ordinance where it makes more sense for them to be, so that potentially we're not missing those in the future, and new staff, hopefully it'll make more logical sense to them as well. But we have again here tonight with us Mr. Jay McLeod from Stewart Incorporated. Jay is the lead project manager day to day for this project, and he will be going over those draft amendments with you. And Jay, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks. Good evening, Jeff, and good evening, Council and Planning Commission members and anyone else who's watching this evening. It sounds like you all can hear me, so I'm going to move forward, recognizing that this is a virtual format. I just want to reiterate that sometimes there's a little lag, or people accidentally talk over each other, or there's accidentally long silences, just so we can make sure that everyone has enough time to respond or ask questions. And we want to make sure that if there's any questions or concerns, that we talk through them and, as best we can, and or regroup to follow up later. So with that being said, thank you again for having me. I'm going to jump into the presentation, which I've just started. Previously, I've been with you to discuss the Chapter 160D updates to Articles 1, 2, 3, 9, and 10. Those are the articles that involve as administrative functions of the UDO, or the Unified Development Ordinance. That's establishment of the review bodies, the review authority for reviewing new applications and development proposals, how to handle nonconformities, and what to do about enforcement. But now, so those are before you in a different venue as the 160D update, and those 5 articles will largely be unchanged moving forward, because we've already incorporated the Garner Forward Comprehensive Plan guidance. That being said, as Jeff mentioned, they will be renumbered in the future, and so I decided tonight to talk about current Articles 4 through 6 as zoning districts and use regulation, which is the interesting part of the code. It's what most people think of when they think of what can I do in which zoning districts and how can I do it. And so that's what I'm here to show you tonight, the progress that the steering committee and the consulting group and staff have made, and the technical staff on the staff side of town staff have made for these 2 articles. So kind of the outline tonight is to talk about a general status update on the project, and then go through the highlights, which are pretty extensive because there's a pretty a significant realignment of zoning districts, and then talk about next steps in public engagement. Once again, this is the project team at Stewart, a series of planners, landscape architects, and civil engineers. We've been working closely with the steering committee and the technical advisory staff, which is the staff planning and inspections and other departments. Our project timeline is here, and you can see, and we're in the first quarter of 2021. And we are talking about the work that's been done with zoning districts and overlay districts in the use table, which really just got finalized at the end of last quarter. And then currently, the Stewart team is working through landscaping regulations and environmental standards and subdivision standards. And so those will be coming forward in another meeting. And kind of a recap of that is in this table, where you see we're talking about existing article numbers 4 through 6, which are drafted and now part of the Garner Forward kind of package, which will be a follow-up that'll be before you for adoption later this year. I wanted to kind of recap some public engagement efforts we've had, aside from the steering committee meetings, which we've been having almost monthly to go over progress and talk through any issues and get guidance from local perspective and local, eyes on the street and understanding of the community. We've also had public informational presentations with facilitated question and answer, which has worked out pretty well, I'd say. And we've had a lot of views of those materials. There's also a project website with all the steering committee meetings, information, and materials posted, as well as the draft articles that are in their current status. And of course, we had a lot of input from the comprehensive plan, which was adopted in 2018 and involved extensive public engagement at that point. There was, of course, stakeholder interviews and a community tour at the beginning of the process. And there's no way I'm going to read all these to you, but nothing you haven't seen in the previous presentations. I just wanted to have it there for the viewers and to make sure that if people are viewing this afterwards, they can pause and read through each one. We also have the guidance from our adopted plans, the transportation plan and the Garner Forward Comprehensive Plan. And we have general recommendations from the comprehensive plan, such as consolidating similar overlapping zoning districts and increasing the flexibility within those districts, and then being more responsive to market conditions and trends. The comprehensive plan also gives guidance about housing character, and that'll factor in just a second here into when I describe the new alignment of the residential districts. We also have guidance from the comprehensive plan to promote multifamily housing and kind of those missing middle types, as they're called, those duplexes and accessory dwelling units, townhomes, and other types of housing that provide a variety of housing choices for people in the community. To emphasize walkable mixed-use areas and to encourage mixed-use development. And now I'd like to move into the proposed updates to the zoning and use regulation sections of the code, starting with residential districts. So bear with me for a second, because this is going to get a little wonky. But on the left-hand side, you have your current districts, R for residential, and the number corresponds to loosely to the minimum lot size within that district. So R40, you need to have a minimum lot size of 40,000 square feet for a single family home. R20, 20,000 square feet, and so on. The new districts are aligned differently. In the new districts, the number represents the gross density, dwelling units per acre, of a single family development subdivision in that district. So a good way to think about it is kind of the equivalency that you see here. But for instance, in the R4 district, where you would be allowed 4 dwelling units per acre in the new districts, that will incorporate 3 of the existing zoning districts as they currently stand. And then there's the creation of a new district, which is more of an urban kind of single family district. This is in response to a lot of the development applications that have been proposed and have previously gone into the PRD district. And basically, there will not be any properties mapped to this new district, but it will become a zoning district that will be at the discretion of council to apply as particular applications come across. And what we're hoping is that this will provide an outlet for these developments when they are appropriate, and reduce the administrative burden and the legislative burden on council from hearing planned development projects by giving a conventional district outlet for that type of development. So, character-wise, what do these look like? Because I should mention, there are 3 ways to control character and density of neighborhoods. You can control the overall density, the gross density, which we are doing. You can control the minimum lot size, or you can control the minimum lot width. And by choosing any 2 of those, you can control the character, which is what the neighborhood looks like on the street, how far apart are the houses, how close are they to the street, where is the parking, etc. So we've chosen to go with density and minimum lot width. So the minimum lot width protects the character of neighborhoods, and the density controls the overall number of people living in those neighborhoods. But what it does give is a little flexibility for developers to provide a variety of lot sizes that best fit a community or a proposed development to maximize the lot count, but not to exceed the density limit in that district. And so it allows really a little bit of flexibility. And what we've found from running some kind of build out calculations in spreadsheets is that it will allow developers to have the opportunity to do those open space or conservation subdivisions without having to have that as a separate type. Because what developers can choose to do is they can choose to have smaller lots and then save the remainder of the tract in the open space areas, or they can put all of the tract into lots of slightly larger sizes, and that gives them the flexibility within that district while preserving the overall density cap of that district. So generally speaking, this is how these would look. So residential 4, like I said, is more or less equivalent to your 9,000 or 8,000 square foot lots that you see in a lot of places in town. Front loaded and alley loaded, it would look something along these lines. Even though the one on the bottom left there is actually a side loaded lot, it would look character-wise a lot like that. Residential 8 is likely going to be alley loaded mostly only. That's our new urban district. It won't be mapped until you all decide in individual applications from developers. And in practice, it's hard to get a front-loaded R8 product because Garner also has restrictions on the amount of impervious surface in the front yard for driveways, as well as we've introduced a maximum lot width, or a lot width standard beyond which a development needs to be alley loaded. And that's because what will happen is if you have too narrow of lots, the lots are too narrow and you have driveways every here, there, and the other, you can't actually park a car on the street in between driveways. And so you run into issues with being able to service those neighborhoods with emergency services or garbage or other just driving around. So the R8 district truly will be a very urban district, and it'll be, houses pulled up to the street with stoops and then alley loaded parking. Just to kind of give you an idea of what other products might look like in these areas, this might be what you might see if you had a duplex. And of course, it's always trash day when I go to take pictures of neighborhoods. Never fails. We do have two multifamily districts, the MF1 and the MF2. Currently, they're not super distinguishable in the existing code. So what we've chosen to do is to take these and make them a little more distinctly different from each other. The MF1 district will be your lower impact multifamily neighborhoods. And then the MF2 district will be more urban style apartments. So with the MF1, you might see something like on the left-hand side, possibly. At the MF2 district, think about apartments that are built right up to the sidewalk. Parking is inside in the back, perhaps in a garage on the back side of the structure. Think about the kind of apartments you see that are 5 stories tall. That would be your MF2 district. The MF1 district is a little bit more low-key. And then the mobile home zoning district will stay largely the same. It seems to be working well as it is. And so this is kind of some examples of what multifamily might look like in the R8 district, for instance. Side loaded, but again, you have a home, looks kind of like just a large single family house. It might have been at one point. It was then converted over to 3 or 4 dwelling units with separate entrances. And this is what an R8 quadplex might look like. And this is kind of like a parking in the rear type structure. So now we're going to move over to non-residential mixed-use districts. But if the council has any questions, or Mr. Mayor, if you would like me to pause for a second and answer any questions, I'm happy to, or I can just roll on.
Yeah, I was going to ask you earlier, and I failed to do that, if you wanted to go on for a while, or if you would entertain questions as you present. So perhaps pausing at the different intervals here would be a good time if council has questions on the items you've just presented. So rather than poll each council member, I'll just ask if there are questions at this point, and if so, council, go ahead and direct your question to Mr. McLeod.
So
Okay,
question.
Gary, go ahead.
Question. So you can either do R2, R4, or R8. There's no other opportunities. You can either do 2 houses, 4 houses, or 8. That's it. There's no, I mean, you within R4 you captured R15, R12, and R9. And I know with R9 that you can be currently, I reckon you get 4 units in, where R12 you could get 3 units in. So we're making someone do either 2 or 4. Can you explain why?
You have hit on a very key component of this. And that's, so I'm glad you brought that up. So we actually have thought about that a lot, and we wanted to make sure that the new zoning districts did not break any existing neighborhood character. And so the planning department staff actually did a small calculation in GIS looking at the number of parcels that basically what you're discussing is exactly right. The R15 is perhaps the most vulnerable, if you would say, to redevelopment or infill development that might be slightly more dense than what they currently have. When we looked at the parcels that might be affected by this, I believe what staff found that it was more or less 5%, 6% of the existing lots in existing neighborhoods that meet the size requirements to where they might be able to be subdivided and then developed in two. Clearly, with an R15, a 15,000, or say an 8, maybe it's a little bigger than the minimum, maybe an 18,000 square foot lot, it could theoretically be divided and then have two homes put on it in the new R4 district. Being that it was only 5 or 6% of the total parcels available, and that there are other factors like homeowners' covenants that weren't taken into account in the analysis, or willingness of sellers, and so on and so forth. The steering committee, when we all discussed it, they didn't necessarily think that it was as big a deal as might otherwise occur, or as might be perceived relative just to the general amount of redevelopment in Garner as it is. Does that kind of get to what you were at, or is there more context?
Well, I go to the infill issue that you brought up. If there's one home on a lot now, and so you're saying if it was a 18,000 square foot lot, then someone can come in and tear that house down and put two houses back on that lot, but they have to get it rezoned first, or they don't have to get it rezoned first.
If there was an existing R15, R12, or R9, it would be rezoned as part of this UDO update to R4, and so they would not have to rezone that.
So you could have a long time established neighborhood that had one house in the lot for 40 or 50 years, and someone could come back and put two houses.
Yes, in theory. If they found just the right lot with just the right seller at just the right time, and so on and so forth.
Right. I understand a lot of conditions it's got to fall right. Of course, that would naturally, if this all got adopted, that would naturally be the first lot that would happen to, be the infill. And that's where I'd reckon I'd have a concern over that. And I know you said staff said it was only 5 or 6%, but what if that 5 or 6% again is, somebody researches this and realizes, hey, we can sell our lot and put two houses there and make twice the return. I reckon I have a concern over that. I mean, because it looks like if you're making every long time established neighborhood with big ranch homes on there, big lots, they could come in and I don't know. It just seems like it could affect the character of the neighborhood.
I understand your concern. We also kind of looked with the not as formally as the analysis that I just described, but we also kind of poked around and found that there are actually a number of lots in existing established neighborhoods, like you mentioned, that are significantly larger than the minimum lot size of their zoning district. And in a lot of instances, they could be bulldozed and subdivided and developed as two homes currently in their existing district, which is kind of an interesting situation in that you don't necessarily, I don't think in Garner, anecdotally see the kind of turnover like that. I think people are usually pretty thrilled to get a house on a slightly larger lot, perhaps making it more desirable and less likely for a developer to go through the expense to bulldoze it and then build two new homes. But you raise a good point, definitely.
Okay, and any existing R40 lots will be a new lot called RA, and that would still only allow one unit per one dwelling per 41,000 square feet, or could someone take those lots and subdivide them also, or would they have to get those rezoned?
Those are largely the R40 is just transitioning a name to the RA. And really, it's probably more helpful to think of the RA, the Residential Agricultural District, as kind of a holding zone before places have sewer. Because once places have sewer, they come in to be rezoned. So really, I don't expect you would see any more development in the Residential Agricultural District than you do now in the current R40, because it's largely the same.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, anyone else quickly before we move on?
I have a couple questions about some of the setback changes, and also I wonder if there's all of them are changes, but proposals, and particularly ones related to single-family homes and townhomes, and then looking at the drastic difference that exists between the front-loaded and the rear-loaded, and how some of those setbacks go from 25 feet down to 10, and it gives me concern. 10 or 15, I believe. I'll check my notes. But you basically have the same type of house or structure, a single family or duplex in that case. But for front loaded, it has all these very large minimum setbacks. in front and rear, but then you rear load it, and all of a sudden you get these really, really tiny setbacks. And what gives me concern on that is you're creating a reduction in the possibility of preserving tree canopy and vegetation, or creating any new substantial vegetation in the rear load when you reduce that much those setbacks that small. The other thing gives me concern, and downtown Garner is a little different because the streets are very narrow. It gives me concern about adequate parking. When you are shrinking, the potential lot sizes get smaller. You don't have as much room for parking on the driveway. You clearly don't. You have limited street parking potentially, depending on the width of the street. I think one of the things in driving around some of these neighborhoods that you start to see is a lot of multi-generational living situations in a lot of neighborhoods. And what that creates is more and more vehicles that need parking. And so you'll have driveway full of cars on the street. And if the road's overly narrow, it creates a very hazardous sort of challenging driving situation in some of these neighborhoods. So my concern with these very short setbacks, and therefore decreased driveways, I would imagine in the back as well, and no parking in these alleys, is a potential parking issue when it comes to some of these rear access and loaded properties. So what is the benefit, the intrinsic benefit of decreasing those setbacks for the rear loaded and not the front loaded?
You raise an interesting point, both in terms of character and logistics of parking those houses. And definitely, let me just start saying that the narrow streets in downtown have been identified, even from the start, I think, by staff, and in terms of the challenges that they pose. And so there has been some thought that we'll be going into street sections for downtown that are kind of help address those concerns.
I'm less concerned about downtown because I know the staff is very aware of them. I'm talking about sort of newer development in other parts that are trying to look urban, even though they're not really. So I just wanted to clarify.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. So in terms of what you kind of described, which is a very good point, I can tell you the way that we have addressed a lot of those challenges, and then maybe you can give some feedback on, what you think about that. But one of the things we've introduced is that alley-loaded units, developments are only permitted when at least 60% of the lots on that block are going to be alley-loaded. So that prevents kind of that snaggletooth look where one might be an alley and the other might be a front-loaded and so forth. So really what that means is that you won't see alley-loaded infill because, one, you'd have to get an alley through a lot of other people's property. But even if you're a corner lot, you can't do it now because we need 60% of that block face to be alley loaded. So that means that in new development, you'll either see a whole block of alley loaded or not, which is good because that's kind of the character of that street. Now the 10 or 15 foot setback, and I don't know off the top of my head which one it is, but it was carefully chosen because there's a definite no man's land when it comes to setbacks when you don't have a driveway in the front. And because when you have a driveway in the front, you want to make sure you have room to park a car between the house and the sidewalk, or else your bumper's hanging into the sidewalk. But when you have an alley-loaded unit, you really want to understand that person is now parking in their rear yard, so they've lost space there, and you want to bring that house forward so that it engages with the street, because an alley-loaded unit is more expensive to develop, and it's going to be a more urban look and feel. So there is some acknowledgement of that, and the character part of it is that when you have an alley-loaded home, you want to be able to sit on your porch and people can walk by on the sidewalk and you can wave or say hi, but you don't have to stop and talk to them necessarily if you're busy. And if you're 3 feet off the sidewalk, you have to stop and talk. But if you're 10 or 12 feet, you kind of can just say hi and they can keep walking their dog. In terms of tree preservation, the tree preservation standards will stay intact, and those are actually in Article 7. And I think some of them may be relocating to a new designated environmental article. Those are going to be development standards, and so those will apply regardless. And if I may be speaking ahead of us now, but I think what we're doing with the landscaping standards is moving from a separated but equal tree preservation and canopy preservation to just a combined tree preservation, because trees have canopies, and if you're preserving one, you're preserving the other. So that's kind of the approach in terms of tree preservation. But you're right. In a more urban, alley-loaded development, you would expect to have formalized on-street parking, and then a lot of times you'll have the street trees between the sidewalk and the curb, or in landscaping islands, instead of behind the right-of-way line or the property line on private property. Although both can work.
So has that been incorporated, that sort of on-street parking and street width for subdivisions and this landscaping issue in relative to this rear-loaded setback, short setback, front setback?
I will go back and look at the exact language. I'm 95% sure we addressed that because it's something I have a pet peeve about, but I wouldn't say absolutely yes without having looked at the language directly. So I'll make sure we check that.
Okay, those are our questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other council members want to weigh in? Okay, Jay, I think we're ready to move to the next section.
Okay. Let me get started back up here. Okay. So now I want to move into the highlights with non-residential and mixed-use districts. So the comp plan gave us some guidance that we should kind of consolidate and simplify our existing 8 non-residential mixed-use districts to kind of streamline, make sure we have very clear distinctions between the districts, and then also to establish, similar to the R8 district, an opportunity for council to apply a new district, a high-intensity activity center district, to encourage redevelopment at select locations as needed. And I'll get into that in a little bit. So please forgive me for this extremely complicated, mess of arrows, but it's to convey with the blue lines that our existing districts, current districts, are kind of moving and transitioning in a certain way. So neighborhood office, which is NO, and neighborhood commercial are going to be combined. They were largely similar to begin with. That's kind of your low intensity light commercial uses, like on the corner of your neighborhood, perhaps, if you live next to a busy street. Commercial retail is going to be changing to commercial mixed use, and it's going to absorb some of the office uses and service uses that you see in office industrial and service business districts. Largely the SB districts, for instance, were already on the major highways, which is where you'd see that kind of commercial mixed use. The central business district, which is downtown, is renaming to the traditional business district in the hopes that there will be instances in other crossroads and little neighborhoods where it is applicable, and you can continue to build that wonderful character of your downtown in other areas in little walkable mixed-use commercial and service nodes. I-1 is light industrial, and that's largely staying unchanged, as well as I-2, which is heavy industrial. Main distinction between those two being that heavy industrial allows outdoor activities and are somewhat more noxious in use. And like I said, the activity center district is also proposed. So kind of to reiterate the intensity of the commercial districts, you see the neighborhood commercial kind of has some more typical setbacks. Commercial mixed use is kind of more your highway commercial uses, which are very kind of suburban in nature. And then traditional business district is the walkable downtown that you have. And then activity center is, think about like the high rises like towers in downtown Raleigh. And again, the activity center would not be mapped during this remapping process. It would be at the town's discretion. The map would be at the council's discretion. So kind of just to give kind of a couple graphic examples of what neighborhood commercial looks like. You all are probably familiar with these types of developments. It's pretty low key. Sometimes you don't even know there's a business there or care because it's just not super active. Commercial mixed use, a very good example is right there in the neighborhood of Town Hall. These are kind of, our more heavy commercial uses. Traditional business district is, of course, downtown. And we don't always do photo simulations of downtown and what it might look like if somebody developed a new building in downtown, but we did for this one, and so I'd hate to not show it off again. And you can see it on the right-hand side there. And so the traditional business district, of course, is very special. It's very unique. We want to protect its character. I will say that the community rec center that the town has installed there is a great add to the area, and especially love the way they did the street tree grates and the street trees with the lighting, the pedestrian scale lighting. It's really good. And so one of the things that the new code does is kind of codify what it means to have storefront windows and what those look like. And so there's an amount of transparency that would be required in the storefronts of these structures on their primary frontages. And this is very similar to what you see there already. It actually does it for all the districts, but this is on your ground floor. Just kind of make sure there's a lot of eyes on the street and window shopping type of ability, which makes those places walkable and enjoyable. New code also introduces, well, it defines the materials requirements that the town already has. Basically, requiring a slightly higher standard for the materials themselves, but being a little bit more flexible in the amount of the coverage that's required. And of course, I think you all are probably aware, but by state code, all towns, counties are not allowed to restrict materials or determine architectural standards for structures built to the 1 and 2 family residential building. And so that's typically single family homes. And so that brings us to the activity center district. I want to be very clear that this would be the type of development that would be towers. It would be the type of development that would make it worthwhile for someone to acquire and bulldoze an entire block and then build a very impressive and very tall structure that could be transit dependent, could have live, work, play all in the same building. And I want to make sure I say that so that I can get any kind of reactions or input that you may have regarding that, because it would be a pretty drastic change from a lot of what Garner has seen. But I think with the downtown South and all that stuff, with the soccer stadium that's happening in Raleigh, I think it's pretty fair to recognize that there's a demand for this and it's coming Garner's way. And if it's used selectively in the right locations, it could be a real boon to the community. Now, that being said, we have introduced standards to make sure that there's kind of some preservation of the quality of life at the street level. And of course, we still have landscaping standards that require street trees and landscaping in spaces, semi-public.
Jay,
so there are back requirements.
It may be only me, but I'm not sure how much you can control your voice volume, but you're sort of fading a little bit at times. I don't know if you get closer to your mic, that would help. I don't know if anybody else is having the problem, but having just a little bit of difficulty hearing you there.
Okay, I'll both speak louder and lean in, and I'll go back and
That
talk.
helps.
Okay, good. And I'll go back and talk really briefly about the activity center. Just to be clear that this would be a redevelopment type of district, which would be in a high activity center. It would encourage transit. It would be a live work play scenario. And it would be very similar to a lot of the tower redevelopment projects that are seen in downtown Raleigh, which have been creeping toward Garner. And so although this wouldn't be mapped, it would be the type of district and project that the council could consider, on a case by case basis, actually, as well as kind of a catalyst project, perhaps. And there have been some places identified in the comprehensive plan where this might be appropriate. So we needed to provide an outlet for that to occur if it was desired by council. And then also just to reiterate, there are standards then for what those developments should look like and the kind of character they should have. And then just to kind of reiterate, light industrial and heavy industrial are largely unchanged. They seem to be doing a pretty good job. There have been some minor changes in the table of permitted uses, but they're largely unchanged. And I should probably pause there if there are any questions about the non-residential and mixed-use zoning districts.
Council, anybody? I have a question for Jay on those items.
If you could go back to the step backs on the towers, I think I brought this up in the steering committee meeting. I do have some concerns about mandating these step backs at different height levels, because what in essence you're doing a couple of things. You're constraining the developer and the architect of the building to some fairly significant restrictions, what that also does, it limits their ability to craft the project. The other thing it does is significantly reduces the amount of revenue the town can get from these types of structures, because you're significantly decreasing the square footage the higher you go. And so I think I had mentioned that in our meeting. I think it's something we need to revisit and allow more flexibility instead of less flexibility, which these current parameters sort of put into place. So that was my feedback, and I think it's just something we should allow more flexibility for that type of development.
I would just do a quick follow-up and ask, unless you mentioned it, what's the theory behind these step backs with the footage requirement that Mr. Dellinger referred to there, as opposed to just a vertical building there?
Well, it does kind of allow for better circulation and light to reach the street, because I'm sure if y'all have been in New York City or something, you know that some of those structures don't have step backs, and it creates pretty significant wind tunnels and so forth. So these step backs have been actually kind of adapted from Raleigh's standards, but made a little bit kind of toned down a little bit to be a little bit more respectful, I think, of Garner's a little bit more laid back nature. So we can definitely look into whether or not these can be relaxed. I mean, they certainly can. The building face could go straight up, but it will have, you know, a change in the nature of the feel of this at the street level around these structures.
Okay.
Well, let me say, I have made this comment before, and we'll say it again, that I have a lot of concern about certain development bringing everything out to the road, to the street. That's a very urban, like as you said, downtown Raleigh or other very urban developed downtowns, larger towns. And I can see in some instances where this, you know, it's fine and dandy, but I'm not in favor of us approving a new UDO that everything's got to be brought up to the street, because I just think that is insane. I've gone around too many towns, and they've changed the character of their towns so much, and I don't think for the good. Downtown Raleigh is downtown Raleigh. That's a whole different animal than Garner. We talk about appearance and how we want Garner to. If you drive from Raleigh into Garner, you want to know the difference, not for it to look the same. Because it looks the same, then why are we having two different towns? So I just have whether that's. I know this is a specific step backs or whatever for tower or something that's going to be several stories high, and this may be more appropriate when we talk about more commercial development. But I have issues with bringing everything out to the street, and everything's parking behind, and everything's parking under. That's fine and dandy in some cases, but to have it widespread to me is, it's like you just mentioned, it's like driving in a cave. And there's a town down east that is really growing and changing, has a large university in it, and that's the way it is. Everything's come out to the street, and it's like driving down in a cave now. It's just really interesting. So I have a lot of concern. I understand your reasoning for these building step backs. It makes logical sense. But then what Damien states also, it does get rid of a lot of square footage. So my concern is having everything out on the street. And you walk out. You got a 10-foot sidewalk, and that's it to the building. In some cases, I think it's fine, but not in all.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Singleton. Any other council member?
Yes, I have a question in reference to your activity center, the concepts you have, and relative to the UDO. And looking at the activity centers and your thought process in the center. I'm making a rough assumption that you've already looked at areas in Garner, in proximity to Garner, where these activity centers may be considered by a developer. Is that correct?
Yes. It's actually identified in the comprehensive plan, and that's really why. Mr. Singleton's absolutely correct that this is not the type of district that I would imagine any council would rampantly spread around their town. It would be a catalyst project, and probably just one catalyst site. And I think the comprehensive plan for Garner does identify 5 or 6 catalyst sites, and probably only 1 and maybe 2 of them were identified as something that might be suitable for this type of redevelopment.
Okay. Okay. That's my question.
Okay, anyone else? All right, I guess we should keep moving on. We still have a lot of material to cover, don't we?
We do, but I'll be brief. The overlay districts have been consolidated. On the top there, you see your conservation overlay districts. They have been clarified and simplified to the extent that that was possible. The transportation corridor overlays were also simplified. And basically the Timber Drive overlays, which you see there in red and below on that map, collapsed and consolidated into one. It kind of preserves the residential nature of those corridors and the landscaping requirements. The US 70 and 401 and Garner Road overlays were collapsed into one, which kind of respects the commercial highway overlay nature of those corridors. And that's kind of the mauve or lipstick colored, I don't know, and whatever that color is, and then the green on that map. And then the I-40 overlay was changed to the limited access highway overlay, in part in recognition that you may want to apply this to I-540 when it's finally completed. And so that was largely kept the same, but simplified a little bit in order to ease administration, but also to make sure you get the same stuff, but a slightly different way and slightly easier. Now I was going to move on to non-traditional districts, which includes conditional zoning, and I'll take a pause at the end of that, and we can come back to overlays if you all are okay.
Okay.
So the non-traditional districts that you have currently are kind of what you would consider planned development districts, and that's your planned unit development, your PRD, which is the planned residential development, PND, which is traditional neighborhood development, and the MXD, which is kind of a mixed-use district. Basically, per the state's legislation, the 160D, Chapter 160D update to the planning and zoning laws, these will be converted to conditional zoning districts with identical entitlements and conditions. So the owners of those properties can feel secure knowing that there will be no changes to their entitlements and they will continue to develop as they were approved by council. Moving forward, we will have the option for a conditional zoning district. And in discussions with the steering committee, it was decided that the 2 options in the center best suited Garner's needs. The first one is option C. It's tier 1, where essentially some developer or someone wishing to rezone would choose an upzoned district, a conventional district, and then they would pare down the uses in that are allowed in that district to just the 2 or 3 or 1 or 5 that they want. And that gives the neighbors and the council a little bit more certainty when approving that rezoning. A tier 2 district would involve a little bit more stringent review, and it would involve a conceptual master plan. So in this instance, think about a site plan where you show the general locations of roads coming into and out of the development, and then kind of portioned off areas and talk about this area will be commercial, this area will be residential, this area will be industrial, and then again have the uses listed for each one of those areas and pared down as well. So it's just a slightly higher amount of scrutiny for that rezoning. All of these would be legislative decisions, just like a regular rezoning, which means that the council is free to interact in a way with the public that they're not allowed currently with the combined conditional use district zoning, which involves that quasi-judicial process. And that concludes that portion. I'm happy to answer any questions or take any direction regarding that.
Okay, Council, anything?
Can you go back to that slide, please, Jay?
Absolutely.
So you said in B on tier 2 that it's a conceptual bubble master plan, that this area is commercial, this area is residential, this area is office. Now, are they tied to conditions? I mean, can they change that? If their plans change, can they change those bubbles? I mean, could it all be commercial or could it all be residential?
Well, the plan kind of is the condition in some respects. So there would be text conditions, and presumably in a tier 2 conditional zoning, there would be a number of dimensional standards that were different from your traditional districts, that then they would offer up mitigating design features to make sure that the intent of the code is protected. There is some small amount of administrative leeway in terms of realigning an internal road a few feet, that, you never know at the rezoning necessarily what you're going to put there. But if there was a significant change, it would come back to council for a rezoning.
Okay. And on tier 1, the restrictions with uses further restricted and or mitigation by design. So I'm assuming the same thing would apply to tier 1. If there were significant changes, it would have to come back and be rezoned or conditions added or deleted. Okay. I see you shaking your head. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, anything else, other council members?
I have one comment. I think it would be helpful for the steering committee and for the council and maybe even the planning commission to see. I know that other municipalities have already adopted some of these practices. It might be useful to see what some of these actual ones look like that have gone through the process in other places. So what does a tier 2 look like? And what does a tier 1 look like? I think that would be very helpful to have a sort of concrete example of each of those, so that we get a better feel for what our role would be with these conditional zoning districts.
Absolutely. Yeah, the hand waving is okay, but it's not great. Understood. I will get a conceptual master plan example and make sure that is available.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Matthews or Mr. Vance or Ms. Behringer, anything?
I have nothing. Good.
I have, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, I think we're ready to move again.
Yes, sir. So use regulations. So this is our table of permitted uses. It looks a little bit different, but it functions the same. Essentially what will happen is a person will come in the door and say, I want to do this use on this property. Staff will go to the table of permitted uses. They'll look up the zoning district and look up the use, and then determine if it is P, permitted, or if it is S, requires a special use permit. And if there's nothing there, then it's not allowed. Like I said, what will happen after they determine if it's allowed or not, then they'll scroll down to kind of the bottom of this article, and there is a list of definitions for each use and then specific use standards for each use. So for instance, let's say I wanted to open a daycare in the neighborhood commercial district. It's permitted, but then I scroll down to those specific use standards and it says, well, a daycare is permitted by right, but you need to put in a privacy fence if you're next to a residential use so that they don't have to see 20 kids running around and screaming in the backyard. Something along those lines. So that's kind of how the permitted use table works with the specific use standards. And then, of course, there are additional standards for if you're developing something, and those relate to landscaping and setbacks. And so kind of maybe as way of example, that tier 1 conditional zoning district might look like someone walks in and wants to do a tier 1 conditional rezoning. Really, they just want to do townhouses. And so what they do is they say, well, I want to be neighborhood commercial, but I will cut out all the other uses except for townhome. And then council would hear that request and could decide whether or not that was an appropriate use for that location. Accessory dwelling units are a big one. We updated that. Basically, there are now slightly more allowances and design standards for accessory dwelling units. We wanted to make sure that people had the ability to be flexible and to care for, to either generate additional income or accommodate the needs of other family members that may need them. There is a density ceiling so that the character of the neighborhood is not overly impacted by the addition of one additional dwelling unit every now and then. There is a restriction on the overall area. There's an additional parking requirement. There's restrictions on the sale of those ADUs. So that was an important addition. And there's couple of good pictures of 2 ADUs that look better than the one that's across the street from me, but neighbors are fine. So that takes us to the remapping. So when we change from our current zoning districts to our new zoning districts, we will need to relabel a lot of zoning districts. Obviously, almost all of them have had their names changed, even if the standards have not substantively changed. So the eternal question that most people are interested in is, will I be rezoned? And the answer is maybe and you won't know it, or maybe and you will, and we have a way to hear from you and make sure that we get it right. So right now, we're in the process of developing the draft rezoning map. We intend to have it available for the public to review after the March 4th planning public meeting. There is going to be a website where basically members of the public will be able to go and slide this little slider back and forth and see the existing zoning versus the proposed zoning. And then there will be an informational resource to help them find the differences between those zoning districts. They can do this from the comfort of their couch on their cell phone. And then they can contact members of the planning department for questions, and or we can still refine this draft rezoning map before it goes to the council production, make sure that as many people have been accommodated as possible. And there are going to be additional separate outreach events associated with remapping, make sure as many people in the town are notified as possible. And that's probably a good place to pause before I talk about the next steps, if there are any questions regarding the remapping or the table of committees.
Okay, council, questions at this time? Anybody?
No questions?
Okay, hearing none, Mr. McLeod.
Okay, so that brings us to kind of a description of the next steps moving forward as we have proposed them. As I said, a public rollout of these articles that we've just discussed will be a description of the changes at the public meeting, which will be filmed on March 4th, including then the ability for the public to look at the draft rezoning map. Currently, the Stewart team, the consulting team, is working with staff to finalize landscaping articles, subdivision, and then Article 11 is the definitions, which is always left to the end. We are renumbering and reformatting the entire document. Moving forward, as opposed to the strike-through underline version that you have seen with the Chapter 160D update, there have been so many reorganizations and relocations that it's become unfeasible to move forward like that with the Garner forward update. And so what we're proposing is a renumbered and reformatted clean document in conjunction with a table that summarizes the substantive changes within those articles and links to the old section as well as the new section. So that would be something that people can skim quickly and see the highlights, essentially. And then we are continuing our public outreach as part of this process to make sure that people are aware and as engaged as they would like to be. And that concludes the presentation. There is a project website, and it's pretty easy to find, and it has a lot of information on it, and I encourage everyone from the public to go and check it out. And again, I'm happy to answer any additional questions or take additional direction from council as you see fit.
Jay, I guess it goes without saying that the public rollout meeting would be a virtual meeting.
I believe it is a virtual format, yes, at the current moment. And we have had a great attendance and viewership of those. It's been very encouraging.
Good. Okay. All right. Anything else, the council?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Just want to know what has been the engagement of the public? Has the public been engaged with the process?
We have had a lot of people view the meetings. We've had a lot of question and answer that first meeting. We haven't had a public meeting since then. We will be introducing an online survey at the next public informational town hall meeting, which will also have Q&A associated with it. And then the planning department through the webpage is always available to take comment. Also, just to kind of reiterate from the beginning, the comprehensive plan was developed with a lot of public input and has largely provided the roadmap for this effort. And generally speaking, in my experience with doing UDO updates, a lot more people are involved in the visioning and the dreaming of the comprehensive plan than in the technical specifications of the UDO update. That being said, though, we do have a number of private sector developers on our steering committee, and I'm sure a lot more watching in the larger community that will provide specific feedback.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I ask a question about the additional dwelling units?
Yeah, yes, please.
And I may need, whether it's you, Jay, or Ashton Jeff, I'm assuming that some of those may be allowed now in certain residential areas. Those would only be allowed in newer neighborhoods, which have HOAs may or may not allow those. So these additional dwelling units, there may be not every residential neighborhood would allow those. I'm assuming based off what active HOAs may or may not allow. That's correct, right?
That is correct.
Okay. I just think some people may watch this and think, oh my gosh, the neighbors are going to put a additional dwelling unit in their house and they can rent it out to somebody. And that doesn't apply to every neighborhood, but in the older neighborhoods, it may be because they may not have an active HOA.
That is correct. And we did build in density tiers for those older neighborhoods so that you wouldn't necessarily see overnight a whole block suddenly have twice as many dwellings in it.
Okay.
So there is some sensitivity to the size of lots with regard to the ability to accommodate an accessory dwelling.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Jeff, I always want to be sensitive to our time, but at this point, I should I see if there a particular question or two from a planning commission member?
I think it would be good to at least those who are participating on teams just to check and see if they have any questions. That would be great.
Okay, I'm aware of 2 members we had. Maybe there are others now, but if anybody has a question for Mr. McLeod, we'll entertain it from you at this time. Okay, hearing none. Let's see, Mr. McLeod, are we completed with your process now, right?
We are, and thank you so much for your attention tonight. I know this stuff is sometimes tedious and it's really detailed, but I really have appreciated the opportunity to share it with you and get your input and direction. Thank you.
I do have 2 quick comments and questions. I apologize. I didn't jump in after Mr. Singleton quick enough, Mr. Mayor. One is I just want to reiterate Mr. Singleton's point earlier about setbacks and roads, and that the setbacks we have served us well and have created the character we see around us. So I think we need to pay very close attention to those. The other is in looking at the strike-through version. I know that the purpose of a large point of the rewrite of the UDO is to create more clarity in the UDO itself and get rid of some administrative stuff. But I do want to have some concerns about the planning director input and discretion being removed in some places that I think are important, because a lot of these things kind of do have nuance. There are quite a few places where we have that now. We have that sort of not intervention, but consultation with the planning director to give guidance to a developer. Whereas we strike those, there's that green light to say, well, you don't have any say over this. We're just going to go. So I think we go back to the steering committee to look at that again and see where it makes sense to keep it and where it makes sense to really, it's just not necessary. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay.
Absolutely. Just to kind of respond to that quickly, a lot of that is due to the Chapter 160D update requiring administrative decisions, as you're aware, be made based on objective measurable standards. And we have a couple of ways we can address that. We can either make administrative standards, and the steering committee will help identify those particular instances of discretion. We can do that to kind of help smooth that process over. And we always have the option for an applicant to file a variance request with the Board of Adjustment as a pressure relief valve to have a quasi-judicial hearing. It's a little bit of a burden in terms of the process, as you all are aware of, that goes along with a quasi-judicial hearing. But it is always a pressure relief valve when standards seem to be to not apply well to a particular situation. But we will work to identify those locations and draw an administrative objective standards box for the planning director.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Mr. McLeod, let me thank you for your presentation and for being with us this evening. You took some material that some of it is challenging, but I think you held our attention pretty well and gave us some good information with the various different districts that we'll be dealing with in the future. So again, thank you for your good work.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Okay, Jeff, let me see. We've been going on a little over an hour, so I think we can continue on. Are you ready next? Is it item 2?
I am. I just need to get my screen shared here.
Okay.
And make sure that I'm selecting the right item.
Mr. Mayor, while Jeff is getting set up, just a reminder that we've invited planning commission members to stay on for this item as well, because some of this information would be useful to them. So just a reminder to everyone and to continue to extend that invitation to them.
Okay, yes, thank you, Mr. Hodges.
There we go. Can you all see the presentation now?
I believe so. The 160D review process recap is the first slide there.
Yes.
Okay.
And before I delve into this in great detail, I did just want to kind of bridge the two presentations with just a couple of notes on some of the questions that were asked earlier. Just I think what are some important takeaways. We've certainly heard that not bringing up everything to the street is something that we want to preserve and not make some kind of wholesale drastic change. So I think it's important to note that I think we've been very, very cognizant of the fact that there aren't going to be any areas that are pre-zoned with those kind of abilities, that it's going to be something that would be very selective in terms of where the council and staff, we might encourage you to consider adopting those things and be very, as Jay noted, very selective about where the comprehensive plan would call for those kinds of things. On the residential side, just in terms of noting where how close you bring those setbacks up and trying to allow for good sized trees in the front yard. That 10 to 15, you really don't want to go any closer than that. The 10 to 15 does allow for folks to still plant the large canopy trees near the front of their front yard, because you still have space between the property line and the sidewalk. And so, most trees get about 30 feet wide at maturity, so you at least want to have half of that space preserved in your front yard. So I think, again, we've chosen those kinds of things very carefully and cognizant of some of those other efforts and regulations that we'll want to make sure marry up with the zoning requirements. And then finally, two more quick things. I know Mr. Singleton talked about the R9 to R15 kind of all going to one district, and not that this is really, I think Jay answered the majority of the question. I think in approaching it, I would just say that we noticed as staff that really there's not a lot of difference in appearance from the street between those districts. They have the same building separation and side setback requirements. The lot widths may vary slightly, but as the lot size goes up, the houses tend to get bigger as well. And so really the only major difference we find in the built environment is that the backyards get smaller. So there's really not huge differences that you see from the street. It's more back behind what you don't see from the street. And so from that perspective, we felt like those could get consolidated into a single district at which, folks could choose again how deep they want their lots to be, because we still will have a width requirement. So the spacing of things will still be the same. And then finally, just a note on the Tier 1 versus Tier 2 conditional zoning, and this will come up in my presentation now. Jay did mention the bubble plan that kind of comes with that Tier 2. I will say that he had an option A there that was crossed out, which referred to more detailed site plans, like a very detailed site plan to the point of almost being construction document approval. I think for reference, I would just say, expect the bubble plan not to be probably any less descriptive than the planned residential district books that you see now in terms of the site plans and subdivision plans that they show. But they still may very well be more complete two-dimensional plans of what we would require at the planning department's level. If for no other reason, then I think developers will want to have one less step to go through after rezoning. So in some respects, I think they'll be willing to go through some extra effort up front just so that they don't have to come back to staff afterwards with a preliminary plan approval, when they can just go ahead and include that as part of their zoning conditions. So just wanted to provide a little bit of clarity on that in terms of some feedback that we've gotten initially to the process. But having said that, let's get into the new review processes, which are being mandated primarily by the 160D updates, and will carry through to the final Garner Forward product as well. So Chapter 160D, just to recap again really quickly, what is the purpose? Primarily, we boiled it down to three things. It consolidates county and municipal zoning and subdivision regulations into one chapter. Currently, they're in two chapters, and they don't always match. It reorganizes years of amendments that have taken place at the state legislature, and then it clarifies what authorized review processes there are, and that towns and counties can offer to provide more uniformity across the state. We've seen a big push for this in recent years to have there be a little less diversity, or in some cases you have developers working in multiple jurisdictions, whether it's within the same county or across counties, and approval processes can look remarkably different. I think we see this also with the building code in recent years. There is some effort to make these things a little more uniform so folks know what to expect. So what review processes are authorized? As Jay mentioned, there's administrative review. In those cases, the standards are very objective. They're designed for staff to implement, administer, and enforce our ordinance. And when I say the ordinance, that's the UDO and the zoning map together. Administrative reviews are for things where there are no ordinance changes required. So again, whether that's changes to the text or changes to the map. So that'll be important when we get to a couple more slides. So don't forget that. Administrative is only for things where ordinance changes are not required. Then you have legislative review processes. This is very specific, where the council is the final decision maker, and the planning commission is brought in to give a citizen perspective and a referral and recommendation. These types of reviews are for general policy decisions, And I underlined amend because we do that most often. We amend the UDO or we amend the zoning map. Once in a while we do adoptions and repeals. We're getting ready to do that here next month, and we'll again in about 9 more months. But that's fewer and further between. And then finally, quasi-judicial review. There's a number of different things that can be quasi-judicial. I will point out that variances and appeals are specifically appointed to the Board of Adjustment by state statute. The Board of Adjustment, however, can be the council if you elect to be the Board of Adjustment, or in our case here in Garner, we have assigned variances and appeals to an actual separate Board of Adjustment. So that, again, we're not changing any of that with this 160D process. So again, we'll just notice that those will continue. Special use permits can be heard and decided by either the council, the planning commission, or the Board of Adjustment. The key is it needs to be a single hearing. The same appointed board that council picks is the one that has to hear it and decide it. So there is a slight difference here going forward in that SUPs will not go to the planning commission for any kind of pre-hearing, so to speak. There will also be, I would say, fewer of these going forward as well. So all in all, I don't see that being a huge change when the rubber meets the road. But these are subjective, they're discretionary decisions, and they're based on evidence that regards specific applications of development ordinance regulations and dealing with safeguards that are important to the community. So here, just to kind of break down what you'll see going forward, I listed here the various types of applications that folks can make to the planning department. And so under the administrative column, you'll see sign permits, different types of residential zoning compliance permits for accessory structures and home occupations and things like that, fences, plats, so both preliminary and final plats. So preliminary does include preliminary major subdivisions. However, I'll put a big star by that going forward, because I don't want you to think that staff is suddenly going to be approving every subdivision going forward. But the standards there are objective, and the state has kind of called attention to that there should be, for the most part, unless there's other impactful situations, that is a objective standard and is more of a by right kind of situation, particularly for smaller subdivisions. And then finally, site plans. But again, I'll put a star by that one as well. Then you move into the legislative section. And so you have general rezonings. We don't do a lot of those currently, but that will still continue to be an option where someone can just request a zoning category and don't put any conditions on it. I don't anticipate us using that much anymore, probably even less than what we have recently. Largely because if you skip past text amendments, which we know about, nothing's changing there at all. We're introducing that tier 1 conditional rezoning, or what I like to call conditional rezoning light. We have not had this option before, and so this I think will largely take the place of general rezonings, because what it will do is it will offer folks the opportunity to pick a zoning district, but rather than open it up to all uses, they can actually pare down the list of uses, and so they can bring it into more of a focus. So if there's particularly noxious uses that you as a council would be concerned about, the applicant can actually exclude those and give you a little more confidence about what they're going to be bringing to the table. You won't see the site plan or the subdivision plan specifics with the light version, but you will see the pared down list of uses, and they also would have the option to submit any other conditions that they would like to offer in a textual format. So if there were a case where giving certain architectural or site plan element conditions without going through the whole site plan or subdivision plan development, they could do that as well using this conditional rezoning light application. But the majority of what we're going to see going forward is largely going to look like what you've been seeing in the past. It's just that we're not going to have this quasi-judicial special use permit attached to it. That is one of the other primary purposes of 160D, is to separate those processes. No longer shall the two mix. And so you will see in a lot of cases where folks need a rezoning. Again, we don't have a lot of property that's what I would call proactively zoned, where the zoning's already in place to do certain types of development. Most of it is going to require a rezoning. So wherever that rezoning, again, is required, you're amending the ordinance, so that has to go through legislative review. You will see those rezonings come with the preliminary plat, which we call the subdivision plan, or it may come with the site plan, just like you see it now. So it will look the same, but you won't have that added burden of Mr. Mayor making all of those disclaimers and do you consent to and swearing in and all of that kind of stuff. So again, it will largely look the same in terms of the information you'll be receiving. You just won't have all of the other quasi-judicial concerns to worry about. But speaking of quasi-judicial, administrative appeals, so appeals of administrative decisions that we make at staff level, go again to the Board of Adjustment. Variances go to the Board of Adjustment. We do also have a flood mitigation permit for development in the floodplain where it can be allowed. In those cases, the Board of Adjustment actually acts as the acronym and name escapes me, but it's basically a floodplain administration board. So the Board of Adjustment does kind of double as that, and those specifically get handled through the engineering department. And then, of course, special use permits. So special use permits, again, that's the one that you in the past have reserved for yourself as opposed to assigning that to the Board of Adjustment. So those will continue to come to you for approval, and there will be some, like I say, there will be fewer of those, but it does bring up some unique characteristics where you have a special use permit for a particular use that's part of a larger development that may otherwise be by right. And so that will lead to some very subtle changes in terms of what you see and hear about and talk about at the rezoning phase, because that special use permit will need to be handled separately and will typically come after the fact, after the rezoning with the site plan or subdivision plan. Sorry. So here's just kind of a flow chart for administrative. There can be a pre-application meeting. It will still be required for the plats, the various types of subdivisions and site plans that we would be in charge of. The applicant will make their submittal following that. It involves a staff or TRC review, and then the decision gets made and appeals of those decisions go to the Board of Adjustment. Not really anything different in terms of that workflow going forward. For legislative, this is where you see the difference. And I will note that, again, this is where the bulk of your work lies with the rezonings and the larger developments. So again, pre-application meeting is required for all of the items that fall in the legislative review process. Folks will make their submittal. The staff and TRC review will start. The neighborhood meeting is still required before any initial hearing that takes place. And this is the biggest change. Your public hearing happens first. So think of it like the text amendment process works now. You have your public hearing up front. So now you've got your neighborhood meeting occurring. You've also got your public hearing occurring further in advance in the process. So this really opens things up to the community much more than it has in the past. All of this takes place before it even gets to Planning Commission. So you've got, again, it kind of meets that objective of getting folks involved and having their voices heard and their concerns heard earlier in the process. Once you hold the public hearing and the goal of that hearing then is to kind of get all the concerns out on the table so that the Planning Commission can then take up the matter and hopefully make some recommendations along with staff to try to address those concerns that get stated at the public hearing and neighborhood meetings. And then finally, it comes back for a decision by the town council under your old or new business. And then finally, appeals get sent to the judicial system, either as declaratory judgments or in some cases directly to Superior Court. So here again, we're going to be encouraging folks to have their neighborhood meeting as early as possible. At the same time, we don't want them going too early because we don't want what I would call bad plans or plans that haven't taken staff comments initially into account going out to the public. So we generally want them to wait at least one round of staff review before they schedule that neighborhood meeting. But our policy going forward will be for them to have that as soon as possible because they don't know when they're going to be going to public hearing, and that could be sooner rather than later. And they do need to have that in advance of that public hearing anyhow. Then finally, quasi-judicial. Again, not any major changes to this process except for bringing another board into the process since it's to one board only. It requires a pre-application meeting with staff. They'll make their submittal again, and staff TRC will do their review. Neighborhood meetings still apply, so there is still that interaction between the developer and the community. But then it goes from there into this kind of courtroomy type public hearing in front of the appointed board who hears it and considers the decision all within that operation. So again, special use permits will stay with the council and all of the others will be handled by the Board of Adjustment. And in all cases, these appeals go to Superior Court from those final decisions. So I wanted to highlight just a couple of things here at the end of the presentation because you may have some questions about what uses trigger SUPs. As it exists today, any use that's marked as a special use permit in the use table will continue to be marked as a special use permit in the use table. And then, of course, we also have these other thresholds that are tucked away in the special use permit process section. And so any subdivision over 200 lots will continue to require a special use permit as it does now. Any other residential over 100 units. We did make some changes to some clarifications, I would say, to the language here because it was very unclear where townhomes fell. So we decided to make the clarification that 200 lots applied to subdivisions and that any other residential project, which typically was just apartments, but could be condos or it could be some other type of mixed use kind of thing. If it has over 100 units, as the apartment threshold is currently, if it's over 100 units, that will go to a special use permit. And then finally, we did consolidate the non-residential just to make it simpler for administration. Most of those were already at anything over 100,000 square feet of gross floor area. The only exception was for office products and so projects, and so we just decided to go ahead and consolidate those for ease of administration. So again, no major changes there. All of those things will continue to require a special use permit as they do today. So what are going to be the most noticeable changes to you? More legislative only items. And along with that comes your, for better or for worse, there's no quasi-judicial prohibitions on ex parte communication. So I would fully expect your email and perhaps your voicemail to get a little busier. Not that we will be, actively promoting that unless you want us to, but just know that by making that process change, with that comes the ability, as much as you are willing to entertain it, the ability of applicants and developers to talk with you in advance. They're no longer restricted to just discussing it with you during the quasi-judicial hearing. So just a heads up, be prepared, something you may want to be thinking about for yourself individually as to how you would like to handle that. And then secondly, I'll go back to just this overarching need to keep the zoning process separate from the special use permit process. The trickiest part for us as staff will come here, and it's most particular, as I noted here, to non-residential projects. So we may see some larger developments come through where one or two of the anticipated uses may require a special use permit, but the rest would not. So you may see us as staff directing some folks to consider just doing a conditional zoning without a site plan, just the textual conditions. I would expect this to be more the exception than the rule, but you could see cases where that conditional zoning will come through first with just the pared down list of uses and text conditions, followed by a special use permit site plan. And then the other scenario is that you could see a conditional zoning with a site plan, but that you may then see a subsequent special use permit site plan modification to quote unquote move in certain uses. So the initial application may be more generic in that it will just say this is going to be a retail site. You still may see the building footprints and you may see some of the larger details, but you won't see specific parking calculations. The parking calculations will be more generic for general retail per se, and that's something that the developer has to take into account. That if they don't have enough parking, it could come down to, as the various tenants move in, and we do this now with existing shopping centers. As each use moves in, we have to do a parking analysis and see if the minimums are still being met. So developers just have to be cautious that they're not providing too little parking so that they run into obstacles in the future with not being able to move in a particular user because that particular user needs a slightly higher ratio of parking. But again, that's just kind of my most noticeable changes of what I anticipate that you will see. Just open it up to any questions and I'll be glad to pull up any of the previous slides if necessary. And just kind of wanted to get you some preparation for what you'll see probably starting in April.
Okay, question by council. And while they're thinking about that, Jeff, do you take on the new role of answering inquiries from developers that might be directed in a different way? I say that in jest, by the way.
Oh, yeah. You had me thinking about that one a little.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I can anticipate that council members and others can be tried for that one, I suspect, in the future, as you so ably pointed out. Okay, council members, questions for Mr. Triesenberg with all the new information that we have here. Ms. Perry, do you have any?
I just want him to reassure us that it's going to be so much easier now.
In terms of procedurally, yes. Most definitely procedurally, it will be. And I think by the time it gets to public hearing, with all of the additional input and feedback going back and forth in advance, it should make the hearings and everything else much more smooth as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Good. Thank you. Mr. Vance, any questions for Mr. Triesenberg?
Not at this time.
Okay. Mr. Matthews?
Not at this time, sir.
Okay. Mr. Dellinger?
Yeah, just a quick question. You talked about sort of the conditional zoning, and then there may be a follow-up with a special use permit. Can you give an example of that? And at what point would we become aware that there is a special use permit component to development?
Right. Well, hopefully with the pipeline spreadsheet, we'll continue to track those things. So when they do get submitted, I think most of the times you'll see it in a retail setting, where one of the things I think in the past that has triggered a special use permit for certain retail uses is whether or not they have an outdoor component to that retail operation. And so the developer may not know that they're going to have one of those initially. They may build it into the site plan in anticipation of it, but they may not actually have anybody lined up. So when that user comes to the table and they want to kind of do the upfit to the shell space, we're always issuing some kind of compliance permit. For those that don't require special use status, they're getting a administrative zoning compliance permit. So it could be just that use will then need to come and get their special use permit from you. And at that time, you can go back and look at the site plan that was approved and say, okay, you do have these other impacts that require this special use status. There may be some exterior changes to the site plan that we want you to make conditionally in order to get the special use permit. So if that kind of makes sense, it's not just the interior upfit, but it gives you as the council an opportunity to put some conditions about kind of exterior upfits.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and Mr. Singleton?
No, sir. I appreciate Jeff's explanation as we kind of walk through this, because we're going to walk through this very soon, as he said, in April. So I'm sure we'll have some missteps along the way, but that's how you learn.
Yeah, I'd like to say that we've had some good preparation in talking with developers already. So hopefully, at least in our minds, we've worked through some of the kinks, but I fully anticipate we'll make a few little stumbles, but we'll keep you going forward as best we can.
Thank you, Jeff. I know you will. And thank you for the time. I should ask, are there any planning commission members with us who have a question or comment? Okay, hearing none. Jeff, you're completed, I guess, with your item there, item 2, right?
Yeah, hour and 40 minutes. I'll take that.
Okay.
Strangers.
We haven't been going quite 2 hours, council and others. We obviously have some other matters. Do you want to let's delve into at least one other matter, or do you want to take a brief recess now? What's your preference? Okay, hearing none. Why don't we go ahead and recognize Mr. Roy Lance, who is going to lead us into item number 3 regarding IT infrastructure investments that they have some recommendations on.
Okay, I'm glad to do that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Also, Eric Rucker, our IT director, is participating in this as well. I'll move through most of the presentation, but he will be around to bail me out when it gets real technical. And if you've got questions you'd like to hear directly from him, he'd be happy to chime in as well.
Great.
Give me just a moment while I share my screen. Let's see. All right. You should be able to see the PowerPoint now. Is that right?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, great. Well, we are going to talk to you tonight about some infrastructure investments we'd like to make related to our IT capabilities. And those have mostly come about due to things that we have learned and experienced through the pandemic, which has been a learning process for all of us. I think, like most things, I think what many people have noticed in different parts of their life as it relates to dealing with the pandemic is it has not, and maybe in some cases it has brought about new things, but what it has done a lot of is accelerated things that were already in the process of happening anyway. And that has been especially true in the technology world. We have been had been planning to make increased use of things like Microsoft Teams and SharePoint and the ability to work remotely and do video conferencing, that kind of thing, and probably would have rolled that out in a methodical way over maybe 2 years. And instead we had to rip the Band-Aid off and do it in about 2 weeks, maybe 2 months by the time we got it all fully implemented, but an order of magnitude faster than we otherwise would have. And a lot of kudos to the IT staff for making a number of minor miracles happen, and also our staff and you guys for being adaptable as we figure things out. So that's largely a success, and we've made great use of these tools. There's some stats in the report that we attached. We just untold number of hours that have gone into participating in meetings like this, which have been a lifeline as we've been in various stages of lockdown and that kind of thing. So largely successful, but it has pointed out some areas where our infrastructure is really not quite up to the task. We've been able to make do, but it's really not appropriate. Or maybe if we had known this is how we were going to work, we would have done some things differently. And so now that we've had a chance to experience that, and as the next bullet points out, now we have an opportunity to do something about that and make some changes that we think will position us well for the future, because while things will no doubt get back to some degree of normal, a lot of this way of working will probably stay with us in some form or another. So we have now some funding that's become available. This is related to some COVID Relief Act funding that's been in place for a while with that's gone to Wake County, but they have, as part of their process for determining how best to spend that money, decided in the late fall and into the winter that it made sense to give municipalities a reimbursement for some of the public safety costs that, essentially the, salaries for staff, particularly police and fire, that responded to these medical calls and emergencies. And so part of the way that they could support the work that everybody in the community was doing was to provide that reimbursement. And so in Garner, that amount was $793,000, I think, roughly, but about $800,000 that we received from the county in late January. There's some possibility that there will be a little bit more coming, depending on how they decide to do the calculations, but for now, we know we have that much. And so it makes sense in our mind to put that to use upgrading some of our IT infrastructure, because that's pretty good connection to the whole COVID situation where the funding came from, and it'll put us in a good position in the future. And one other benefit too, and this is a bit of a side note, but just wanted to mention it because we have been talking a lot about CIP and bonds lately. But you may recall in earlier versions of the capital improvement plan that we showed you, there was a project in the general government section called a fiber ring, which was basically a way to connect many of our town facilities on a high-speed internet connection. And what we're proposing to do here will actually make the fiber ring project go away. That was $800,000, $2 million. So that's a significant savings that we're able to offset by doing this. So anyway, a minor detail, but just did want to point that out. There are really three buckets of improvements that we're going to make here. The first is unified communications, which I'll define for you in a second, but as it relates to the staff and the people aspect of it. The next one is unified communications as it relates to rooms, like physical spaces. And then the third one has to do with streaming at our at GPAC. So first, let me talk about the staff ones. And a little bit of background here. One of the very obvious, well, hopefully not super obvious to people on the meetings like this, but very obvious to staff. Most of our staff members do not have a webcam, like they don't have a video camera or a microphone. So it makes it pretty hard to participate in a virtual meeting if you can't be seen or heard. The staff has been pretty creative about ways to work around that problem, but including things like calling in on the phone to get the audio part and to be able to speak, and just not having the video on in the meeting. So there's different ways to do it, and staff members can borrow a laptop and things like that, but not an ideal situation. The reason, or one of the reasons that most of them don't have that, well, in addition to the fact that we didn't traditionally need to use them all that often, but also most employees, or the majority of employees, I guess I should say, don't have a computer in the traditional sense. So, like you all probably, most of you have a laptop or a desktop computer at your house. Most town employees have what we call a virtual machine. So their computer actually lives on a server behind the scenes. And what they have at their desktop is a monitor, or maybe two monitors, and a keyboard and a mouse. And so they interact with the computer in the same way, but the actual computing is being done behind the scenes on a server somewhere else. And there's just a little teeny box on their desk that is helping relay that information back and forth. And that virtual machine was not set up to be able to handle the intensive graphics processing go along with video and audio. So it's possible to do, but again, because back in the day, we didn't think that was a significant part of what we were doing, so we didn't pay to have that be part of our virtual system. So we can fix that by, now I'm getting to the bullets on the screen here. We can fix that by purchasing some things that are called grid cards. And basically, if you have a computer at home, you might be familiar with a graphics card that helps make your video go smoother, and is particularly important if you like to play video games and things like that. I mean, a grid card is basically like a graphics card for the server that hosts many individual desktops on the back end. And so step one would be we need to get a significant, three, because each grid card can handle multiple different virtual machines. But I believe it's 3 grid cards that we would need to have essentially video capability on our virtual machines. And then we would need to have webcams or any sort of audio-video capability. But once we have the grid cards, we can then get a sort of traditional webcam that you might be familiar with for having meetings like this. And then the third bullet is particularly important because at Town Hall and facilities on the Town Hall campus have a pretty strong internet connection. So, once you've got the grid card and the webcam, as long as you've got the ability to send a lot of data back and forth, you're pretty much good to go. But that is much less so the case as far as the internet connection at our remote facilities. So, Public Works, White Deer Nature Center, Senior Center, other staff facilities do not have anywhere near the level of internet connection. So even if you had the first two bullets in place, if you can't pass the data back and forth, then it doesn't do you a lot of good. So we would need to significantly upgrade the internet connection to those facilities. And also there are some employees that probably have a need for what we were calling generically a secondary device. So a laptop, a tablet, a Surface, something like that. And those would be only for some employees, but people who have a need to connect and do their work when they're away from their desk, where the grid cards and the webcams and all that would be. So, you all are using tablets, just some of you anyway, are using tablets provided by the town to participate in these meetings. So that's one example, but there's many other employees that do their work remotely or are now doing their work more remotely than they would be. So in some cases, we would propose to provide a secondary device. Right now, we have a pool of loaner laptops, but they're not necessarily the most current laptops, and there aren't enough of them to provide for every employee. And then the last bullet here is what we call mobile device management software, which for all the computers that are on the town's network, we have the ability, IT has the ability to manage those computers remotely. So that could mean keeping them up to date software-wise, adding patches and updates as needed and scheduling those to happen automatically. It could also be, an employee having some technical problems and they call IT, and IT can remotely connect to their computer to fix things. That capability does not currently exist for any kind of mobile device. So, phones, tablets, and anything that's not regularly connected to the town's network. So if we get software, we could do that, which would allow us to keep everything current. You wouldn't have to worry about, have you downloaded the latest version of Teams to make sure that it's working properly for this meeting and that kind of thing. So that, in a nutshell, the upgrades needed for unified communication. Sorry, I did tell you I would define that. That is basically Teams or programs like that allow you to chat and have audio and video conference meetings, that kind of thing. So that's what we need what we're proposing to upgrade for the staff needs related to unified communications. So I can, I'm happy to pause there, or I can keep going through the other buckets, whatever you would prefer.
Why don't we pause briefly there and see if council has any questions, and then we'll move on to the other bucket. One of those, I think, has to do with council and chambers and so forth. But at any rate, council members, questions for Mr. Roy Lance. Ms. Behringer, anything?
I do not have any questions. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Dellinger?
Yeah, just what I don't kind of see breaking down, to see a number for the secondary devices and it's per employee. Approximately how many employees are anticipated to have need or those secondary devices?
We haven't done a full assessment of that yet, so that's why we listed it per person, because we would want to try to provide one for everybody that meets an eligibility criteria that hasn't been fully implemented yet or vetted fully. But for cost estimating purposes, we figured, I believe, about 35. And also providing a few additional, like loaners in case one went down or had to be, get a replacement or something like that. But approximately 35.
And what's the certainty on what those devices would be? The price of that $1,600 to $1,700 seems, one, high, and two, if the Surface is the preferred device, I would want to be sure that device is going to continue to be made over this time frame. It's not a particularly popular device. Microsoft doesn't seem to be selling many of them, and I would want some examination, particularly because it's a secondary device, if iPads or even cheaper laptops might be sufficient, because they also would include cameras as well. But that the price on that seems high, and also just not having a certain number of how many people would have them is hard to pin down a number on what the cost would be.
Yeah, Eric, you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So we identified surfaces because we have surfaces already deployed in a lot of departments, and we've had them deployed for the last 5 years, and we've had good success with their deployment. The reason why the price is actually it is high is it includes a 3-year accidental coverage protection plan, so that any device that would potentially be damaged during that time frame could be overnighted and replaced immediately. So we're throwing that number in there to include that 3-year accidental coverage replacement plan. That being said, it does not need to be a Surface. It does need to be a Windows device at this point. We've identified a lot of pain points with iPads. So we are kind of recommending at least a Windows device to kind of help facilitate all the unified communications that the town is capable of providing.
Yeah, and I definitely understand that iPads are very difficult to use as compatible actual computers sometimes. I'd like, if it'd be possible to explore some cheaper laptop options than the Surfaces, that would be helpful, I think. Just that's my 2 cents.
Okay, Mr. Matthews?
Nothing this time, sir.
Okay. Mr. Singleton?
Nothing at this time.
Okay. And Mr. Vance?
Nothing at this time.
Okay. Matt, I believe we're ready to move to the next bucket. Can I refer to it that way?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and just one other thing on the laptops versus Surfaces and so on. I mean, we picked a price to put in there just to be conservative, so it's not so much that it's definitely going to be any particular device, but we wanted to pick something on the more expensive end of the spectrum just so that we could give you a very safe estimate cost-wise. But your feedback is well taken. Moving to the next bucket, this is upgrades that we would propose to make for spaces, rooms, spaces, and the council chambers is a good example. A good portion of this has to do with council meetings. That's where we make heavy use of this technology, or at least we have between remote meetings and some of the hybrid meetings where we have some people participating remotely and some people being in person. Some of the improvements are to the video production room, which is where Rick and Adam sometimes operate out of. So you all don't see that one as much, but that's outside the council chambers. And there's a lot of equipment stacked in a relatively small room. And so we've got some other space nearby that we think we can move some of that equipment to make that room a little bit more workable. And that would also allow us to add a little bit of additional equipment, like some better monitors to be able to see what's happening on the TriCaster, which is the piece of equipment that lets you switch views from the different cameras, and also some better audio equipment so that the person operating in that room can better hear what's going on in the room. We are also looking at relocating some of the ceiling speakers. That is because the room was designed pretty much exclusively for in-person meetings, which made a lot of sense. But for these hybrid type situations, especially where we might need to turn the volume up so that everybody in the room can hear the person remotely, that can hear well in the room. In some cases, the speaker in the ceiling is positioned directly over like a microphone that's coming out of the podium PC where staff present. And so the more sound coming down out of that ceiling speaker goes into the microphone and creates feedback problems. And so we can fix that to a large degree by repositioning where some of the speakers are in the council chambers so that they're offset as opposed to being more directly over microphones. So that should help with the in-room experience. Another thing that will help with that, if the speaker, the every individual person, but particularly every individual council member, has different preferences for volume and that kind of thing. And so right now, we need to sometimes turn up the room audio to make sure it's loud enough that everybody can hear equally well. We'd have more flexibility and probably a better experience for council members if each council member had their own. It'd be sort of a low speaker that would sit on the table of the dais in front of you, like sort of where the base of your microphone is, and it would allow each council member to adjust the volume to their preference, and that would let us keep the volume in the room at a level that works well in terms of not creating too much feedback or anything like that, but gives each council member the ability to fine-tune their own volume level. We would also propose to update the equipment in the training room so that it could be fully functional as an overflow space. I mean, we have always used it as overflow space, but it's really not. If a person if for a public hearing, for example, and it was very full in the room downstairs, if we were using the room upstairs as overflow, we still have to get people from the training room upstairs, the overflow, down to the regular room when they want to speak. With some equipment updates, we could have the person speak from the overflow room. They could see you, you could see them, they could hear you, you can hear them, and so we wouldn't have to worry about shuffling people back and forth. So we could have a fully functional overflow room. And we also think there would be significant benefits to I guess we've learned by setting up teams that in many cases, having me set up the virtual council meeting is not as helpful sometimes as if it were a sort of a general account. So we had to create some separate accounts to make some of these meetings work, because multiple people have to be involved in the settings and getting the meetings up and running. And so if one person's account is the security behind it, like unless I want to give out my login to everybody, multiple people aren't going to be able to log in to a meeting that I set up. So there are better ways that we can set up the Teams PC in the council chambers, and similarly, there are hardware and licensing upgrades that we can make in our heavily used conference rooms that would allow a similar setup, that it's basically a sort of Teams compatible conference room environment. And so we were proposing to make changes to the most frequently used and heavily used staff conference rooms, as well as to provide the same concept but in a portable unit in a few cases. So you can imagine, for example, somebody wanted to do some program on the floor of the rec center at some point in the future, or maybe on the stage at GPAC or things like that. Or in a situation where we have a severe weather event and maybe we're in a conference room that does have one such unit, but it would be helpful if we had 2 or 3 on a temporary basis. So thought it would make sense to have some portable units as well. So that's the rooms update, and that one was a little bit faster than the other one, and I think the third one will be relatively quick as well. So I can jump ahead to that third one and try to wrap up and leave time for questions at the end, if that's all right.
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay. The last one has to do with live streaming at GPAC, which we've already started to do. You all may have seen some of our GPAC at Home series, and it's worked well and it's been very popular. But we have been sort of holding it together with duct tape and baling wire, so to speak. I mean, we are not really set up to do it properly there, and really for 2 reasons. One, I think as things start to return to normal, whatever that looks like, probably having live events at GPAC, an indoor space with 400 people sitting close together, will be among the last things to come back, would be my guess. And also because this is just going to be part of the new normal, whether it's for our own programming or for people that rent the space and would like to be able to stream whatever their performance is, the dance recital, so that grandparents in other states can see their grandkids perform, or whatever it is. This is in our opinion going to be a key element of what we do at that facility from here on out. And so we think it would be very beneficial to just go ahead and invest in the equipment needed to do it properly, which would be to get a TriCaster system, which is similar to what we have at the council chambers, that allows to switch between different cameras and to stream that video. Also to get some better cameras. We've been using, we used a digital camera that had a video capability to it at one point to stream a GPAC show. So we've been very creative, but we don't really have proper cameras that can pan and tilt and zoom and that kind of thing, and a projector system as well. So those are the key elements to try to make streaming a better process, both better for staff, but primarily a better end result for people that are viewing it and or maybe have rented the facility and want to take advantage of this equipment. So I'll hit the cost real quick and then stop for questions. As we kind of got into before, we have some reasonably good estimates, but we are still developing the finer points. So these figures are estimates, but the staff, people-centric upgrades would cost about $160,000 for the first year, and then about $60,000 annually, and that's primarily for the internet connections to all the town facilities. That would be recurring costs. And some of the software, like the mobile device management software too, but the internet connections are the biggest part of that. The meeting room components would be a significant, hardware upfront investment, but not so much ongoing. So that'd be $185,000 roughly, and the live streaming equipment at GPAC would be $39,000 with a $3,000 annual maintenance element. So all told, we're at about $384,000, which is a lot of money for sure. But these, I think, are improvements that are needed to make the reality of what the future holds possible and work well. And it would still leave us about half of the funding that we've gotten through the COVID relief funds that would be available for another use in the future, or just to put in fund balance so that we can save it for another day. So anyway, that's basically it. We just at whatever point we reach agreement, if we do, then we would move forward with getting some of these things in place, some of which we would do ourselves, some of which we'll use an AV contractor to help us with, and we would bring forward budget amendments and that kind of thing, and as needed, and incorporate some of the ongoing expenses into next year's budget. And then the last thing to mention is just there has been budgeted for the last several years an annual amount in the operating budget that goes into a replacement fund for infrastructure. So we would have to reevaluate what needed to go in there. But that amount would go up, but not by a huge amount. The existing funding is already there to cover some much more expensive infrastructure already. But we would look to reevaluate that. So with that, I will stop sharing the screen and ask the questions, and Eric can jump in if he has anything he would like to share as well.
Okay, thank you, Matt, for a very thorough presentation there. And I guess that's a peek into the future, or maybe the future is now, I'm not sure. But at any rate, I think you're asking for feedback. I don't know that we're asked to formally vote on anything tonight. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we will need to bring forward budget amendments and things to appropriate the money and put it in the right place. So that's the ultimate action that you'll need to take at a future meeting. But we are looking for, a general indication that yes, it makes sense to do these things, or part of these things, or whatever it is that you would have to tell us, so that we can then know what to bring forward to you all to approve technically on the budget front.
Very good. All right, I'll poll the council here quickly. We'll start with Mr. Singleton.
Yes, I agree with what's being proposed. The way the world has changed, better technology is certainly a plus. I would encourage the council to consider, and working with staff, once we get through this these budget amendments and so forth. See, it's a projected $66,000 annual cost upgrade. I would suggest that we take that maybe in 20% more, and from this available, 409 left over, set aside in the capital fund. So the next year you've got the money already there, because I know something else will come up that we'll have to spend money on. But with IT, it's just the way it is. So I'm just suggesting that that first, not the first and the initial, but the second annual payment should be set aside. So we're covered on that on the second year. That's my opinion. But anyway, I had no trouble. I read the detailed information that you had before this, Matt, that you and Eric had provided. A lot of detailed information, which is very good, explaining all these parts and pieces. So thanks for the information. I think it's the upgrade will be substantial, and also the fiber ring issue will be resolved.
Thank you, sir. Councilmember Behringer.
I'm in agreement. I think it has to be done. The pace of change and growing needs and so forth, that we can't avoid this. So I'm all for it.
Okay, Councilmember Vance.
Yes, I'm in favor of the upgrades that are being proposed. As has been mentioned, the times have changed, and COVID has shown us that we still can function, and it's necessary to have the upgrades in order to stay on the cutting edge. So I am right in line with what's being proposed.
Okay, Councilmember Matthews.
Yes, sir. Mr. Mayor, I certainly agree with what Grace said there. And if one thing this pandemic has taught us, we, at least in their IT world, we know where maybe we're weak at or shortcomings we're at, and we don't know how long this is going to last or what's going to come up next, and we need to be prepared for it. I got the old motto, let's do it right the first time and get it right the first time. I like the idea of being in the sound business, especially in the musical world, when you got lots of different people around a given area. Your monitor system theory for the speaker at each council member's desk would be ideal. Some hear really well. Myself, I need extra volume, and I can't pick it up out what's going on in the audience. Having that individual volume will be a tremendous help for me personally, and probably a lot of other folks. And those of us that speak real softly, I won't mention names, that I can hear her too, which would be good.
Pay close attention.
But and I'm in total support of this, and let's do what we've got to do to get it right. And in closing, will this, once we implement this, will this help us in the future? We were talking about before the pandemic hit, our emergency operations center and what have you, if we had to ever do that type of thing. Will all of this network into that potential system, or have the capabilities of it once we ever get a chance to revisit that?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Eric. Yeah.
Yeah. So absolutely, the question is absolutely correct. And if anything, it'll enhance that capability. If something happens to town hall with some of this infrastructure, the roving cart surface hub, you could actually have a roving emergency operations center. So if anything, this is just going to enhance that kind of emergency operations center type mentality.
Good answer. And haven't had to deal with that at the county level. A lot of times, some things we're not prepared for. Then when the incident happens, it's too late at that time. And I appreciate that, Eric, and appreciate Eric coming over to my house when I was running in circles trying to get my system up. And he's quite knowledgeable. And I had a dirty office. I was embarrassed, but you sure got me up running. I appreciate that. And that's all I got, Mr. I fully support this. Again, let's do it right.
Okay, Mr. Matthews, I was going to say we're going to give you 2 passes on that technical help. Next time we're going to charge you something. Okay?
Exactly.
Can I get 2 certificates on that, please?
Okay.
I'll cash
Mr. Councilmember Dellinger, your turn.
Yeah, I just want to commend staff and the IT department on doing this transition last year at such an accelerated pace. There's a lot of considerations and moving pieces to ramp up and get us to where we were. And that's a lot of that stuff that happens behind the scenes that nobody sees. So appreciate all the work and long hours I know all of you put in to make all that stuff happen. My only other question is with the unified communications with regards to staff, what percentage of that includes the police department directly? And is there any in there? I know fire's kind of separate, but was there any consideration for their needs given that this is sort of COVID funding?
Yeah, so yeah, they are. The mobile device management piece is a huge key component for the police department. Since they currently are a 24/7 operation, we don't have the ability to have a 24/7 rotation with current staffing. So that gives us the ability to manage them from home and throughout a 24/7 rotation. So that's a huge component that is more so geared towards the police department than it is for the town employees. Also, with that being said, some of the Surface Hub carts are directly related to 3 conference rooms in the police department that have been kind of pain points for the police department to have upgraded at this point.
Awesome. Thank you very much. The other point was, I think we may be able to pass on the touch screens in council for now. I don't know, maybe. I don't know that we'd use them even if we had them. The other thing is the upgrades, being on Parks and Rec in downtown Garner, and Mayor Pro Tem Barringer can attest to this. The COVID has been transformative for GPAC and the staff there, and Lori with what, and anybody who's done an event there, town staff and Rec too, with the equipment that's there has been really amazing. Shoestring is understating it, I think. These improvements are value adds for the town. They're value adds for GPAC. They're value adds for anybody who comes into that space. And like you said, we don't know how much longer we're gonna have to do that stuff, but even after COVID's over, even with a packed house, being able to record those events and broadcast them is a tremendous opportunity for the town. So I'm all on board for those upgrades. And that's all I got. Just good job. I'm looking forward to tighter numbers.
Okay, great, good. Thank you, both Matt and Eric. By the way, Eric's, well, I guess he's not so new anymore in his director's position there, but wanted to recognize that. Sure enough, he's doing a good job for us. Thank you very much, Eric. Okay.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. Council, I'm going to suggest perhaps we take a recess, maybe no more than 10 minutes, and I think we can come back and finish up the agenda before too much longer. So I have 8:20. Can we recess and be back at 8:30? It gives you 10 minutes. Okay, see you shaking your head, so I'll declare us in recess at this time and see you in 10 minutes, all right? Maybe want to turn off your sound and or your video. Okay, I declare we're back in session after a brief recess, and thank you, Council, for being prompt and getting back on time. I think we can move on to the closing part of our agenda. And the next item is item number 4 on the agenda. I'll recognize our town manager, Mr. Rodney Dickerson.
Mayor and Town Council, you have in your packet just the update on the upcoming meetings, just kind of a preliminary schedule that's subject to change. Things are moving around. You notice there's some public hearings coming up on March the 1st. Some UDO, some of the things you talked about tonight will be going forward. On March 16th, we got the Pearl Street Townhome scheduled to come back to you, and an update on the DFI development for now, and then some items at the work session. So that's just for your information. Nothing to do with that right now. So if there's any questions, we'll be adding and amending and doing all those things before those get here. But for the most part, that's what we're looking like.
Okay, anybody have any questions for the town manager, particularly relates to these upcoming items? Okay. Let's see, was there anything else, Mr. Dickerson, other than that was the main item?
That was all under that item.
Okay, any other manager reports?
Yeah, I have manager reports. Just for the benefit of the public, I mean, Mr. Mercer sent a notice out, but town hall offices are closed through March. We do see some of the numbers going down, but I would caution that they're going down from where they were. They're still higher than what they were when the governor put in the first restrictions back in March. So we don't need to let our guard down right now and try to get the vaccine more distributed and those type of things. And some cases with some employees and trying to get through that. So we'll see how that goes. But I don't anticipate going much further than March, if at all. So we'll see what happens. Just wanted to tout the Showcase of Talent again and talking about the shows at the GPAC, but we typically would have a Showcase of Talent. We do have that this year, and it's going to be virtual. Rick, you remember what that date is? That's coming up in March, and I didn't write the date down here. While he's checking that out, we have had COVID testing at Town Hall all this week, and will continue through the rest of the week and into the weekend. I have no idea what the numbers are. There's been a decent amount of cars coming through, no backups or real long lines, but it has been used. And they have had to stay out there in some pretty bad weather yesterday, but I think going forward, it'll be pretty nice the rest of the week and on into the weekend. The other thing I wanted to announce was in talking to Tim Stevens and having to try to make a decision on the wall that heals, through our conversation, we believe that it'd be best to postpone that. We believe we have a really good chance of getting it next year. And just thinking about the experience that we're trying to have with that and with COVID, even though things are getting better, you're going to limit the crowd. There's going to be social distancing. Typically with the wall, people are going to want to touch it. They're going to want to, trace names and do all those kind of things. And we just felt like it wouldn't be the experience that we wanted it to be, that it would be better just to wait till next year when we have, hopefully we'll be out of this. So that was the decision that was made. I don't think we lost any funds or anything on that. I'd have to check with Tim, but there is a very good chance we could get that back next year. And then talking about shows at the GPAC again, the GPAC at Home series has been excellent. If you haven't seen some of those shows, I highly recommend the last one. That was really good. The String Queens, and there's other acts that are really good. I think COVID has allowed us to experience some acts that we may otherwise may not have been able to experience. It's been very diverse, very versatile. Some things that I didn't know you could do with instruments. Certain instruments have just been great. It has been good that we've been able to stream those and to rebroadcast. Typically, when we have artists in live, part of the contract does not allow us to rebroadcast that. So that's something we might need to try to consider and work out. But, that does come with a price tag. But it has been great to be able to see those on demand. And I think that's it for my my items.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dixon. I'll see if council has any questions for you. I would just echo what you just said. I've enjoyed, haven't watched all of them, but I think all of them, maybe but one. But the most recent ones that was excellent, as they all have been. So I encourage both our council members and those members out in the public to tune into those as you can. And we're fortunate to be able to have those, even though GPAC is closed and we can't have live shows there. Council members, any questions for Mr. Dickerson as relates to manager reports?
No, but I will note, Mr. Mayor, that I know that the Wall That Heals was going to be in other North Carolina towns, and I just pulled up their calendar, and it lists already that both the Garner and the Charlotte, which were the second and fourth stop this year, have both been postponed. It still shows it being held in New Bern starting April 8th through the 11th. So I don't know if they'll consider postponing it also. But I reckon because the numbers are high and it's early in the schedule, both the Charlotte and the Garner stops have been postponed as of right now. And their schedule runs all year long, all the way through Veterans Day, 11/11, they'll be in Tennessee. So just would point that out.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Singleton. And while you're at it, do you have any other reports as a council member?
No, sir. I also want to thank Mr. Rucker for help today because I had trouble with my town iPad, PC, whatever we call it, and had to take it up there today because of my issues, but he's already resolved that, and I will pick it up tomorrow. So, again, we appreciate it. I know you had to help Mr. Matthews and had to help me also.
Okay. All right, Ms. Behringer, council reports?
Yes, sir. A couple of issues with trash. How do we get some help? The off ramp of I-40 East onto Jones Sausage Road, that we're having trucks parked there, but not just that, it's just got so much garbage along that off ramp onto Jones Sausage Road. If we could look into, is that our jurisdiction or is that Raleigh's or DOT? Who would we?
The ramps are DOT.
Okay, well, can we talk to somebody in DOT because it is horrible? And okay, comment.
Good.
I was just going to add, if I could, DOT for a period of time had suspended their contract with litter cleanup crews in our area, but they have recently started that back up. So that may help them get to an area like that.
Well, good, because it really looks horrible. And also there was on Creech Road extension, as you pass by Gatewood, there's trash from just nonstop. And I saw on next door that there was a complaint from somebody on the other end on Sanderford Road about the trash. So it doesn't stop where Creech Road turns into Sanderford Road. Is that our jurisdiction, the Creech Road area, or not?
Going that far out, that's either the county or Raleigh. I believe that it's Raleigh. I don't think there's any county in between us and Raleigh, but that would be Raleigh.
Can we contact someone in Raleigh about that? Because it's just as bad as the off ramp off of 40.
But Creech Road is a DOT street. So,
oh my goodness. Okay. Well, whoever we need to contact, it's terrible looking. And then the last thing is that on Jones Sausage Road going north at White Oak, where it crosses the railroad track, that place on the right side of the road there's potholes in it, cracked pieces of pavement are missing. It's a roller coaster ride going across that railroad track. It's always been a problem, but it's not getting any better, and we know that that road it's not going to be realigned anytime soon. So if we can get DOT to come out and look at that and do something to alleviate that problem.
Okay, and I was going to follow up, I believe, on what the town manager said. At the last Campo meeting, which was last week, it was virtual, but they always recognize the different district engineers. And Joey Hopkins, who most of you know, confirmed what was just said, that while much of the funds were reduced or had to be used for other purposes, they have recently been granted some additional funding, or maybe some funding that was taken away before, for trash pickup, because he has received obviously lots of concerns in a lot of areas, even far beyond Garner. But he indicated that they hope to be able to get some crews back working, but noted that it is a widespread problem. So it's nice to know that they have some of that funding back anyway.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Dellinger.
Yeah, just want to reiterate to the point of the town manager on the COVID direction. It is going in the right direction. The hospitalizations are dropping. The increases are flattening out. The death rates in the county are flattening out as well. But schools are going back soon. And so there's going to be another sort of stir. So everybody needs to just keep those precautions up. We've done a great job over the past 2 months in getting those numbers and that rate down. So we just need to continue to be cautious and take precautions.
Thank you, sir. And let me see, Mr. Vance.
Well, I'll just say that everything has been said that I was going to say reference to the trash and the wall and COVID. We know there's a lot of activity going on, and I will just reinforce what has been said in a positive manner.
Thank you, sir. Okay, and Mr. Matthews. You need to unmute, Mr. Matthews.
Kathy got me again.
Try that. Yeah, better now.
There you go. But
You're so pitiful.
I was somewhat reluctant to bring this up, but I've had so many people contact me on it, as well as church and or around town and calls on our next vaccination. I think if we could handle this differently and open this thing up for everybody in Garner, would be most important. I've got a lot of 81-year-old folks I've talked to that haven't got down to Johnson County and get it. And the question is, if we're having it Garner, why can't I get it in Garner? I know they changed it there at the end, opened it up because I happened to drive up there to see how it was going and talking to some of them on Saturday. And but if we're going to do this thing again, let's open it up to everybody. We'll pack that place. There's no doubt in my mind, because we could all get behind it. And so I just want to say, have everybody get an opportunity. You know, we all got relatives or up in age, and I'm one of those of sorts. But if we're going to have that, we all represent the entire town, and we need to make this thing available for everybody in this. And I don't mean that derogatory. I just mean it in an open mind and spirit of taking care of all of our people. And I'd like to see us do that a little different next time. I know the county had a lot to do with it, but we need to talk with them too. Say, hey, you know, this should be for everybody. As Mr. Dillinger said, we're getting that line going where we want to go. Let's really hammer it and go after it, and all be part of it. And that's just, it was on my mind. I just want to put it out there, and in the spirit of goodwill. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, thanks, sir. Yeah, and on that point, I will say we sent out an explanation this afternoon from an inquiry we had, and as was noted, we were a host site. The county put some parameters around that, and certainly they are trying to target some areas of and some groups of our communities that statistically have not been available, or vaccines have not been available. So obviously we're trying to get everybody vaccinated, and especially some of these groups that have had low participation rates or inability to get to vaccination sites. So we'll certainly continue to do all we can to host these sites as a town for everybody to get vaccinated, and that's the ultimate goal. So,
Mr. Mayor,
I'm sorry.
I just want to comment and respect Mr. Matthews' position and statement, and I'm in agreement. I think we do need a broader participation, but also recognition that, you know, public health, when it's done properly, is a data-driven endeavor, and it's a community and education endeavor too. And so, I think we have to trust at some point that they're making the right decision to continue to reach people who can't be reached sometimes. But I think, you know, the county, we do need to work better with the county and make sure we can get everybody going forward.
Sure. Yeah. And as well, there's no question that that's the ultimate goal. And you've seen, obviously, within the last week or two, obviously, some renewed efforts as it relates to these mass vaccination sites. Obviously, the PNC Arena being the one I guess most people are aware of. But I think everybody's learning from the difficulties they've had and some of the logistical problems that they've had. So it's operating smoother now. I don't know how many of you, obviously by my age, I am now eligible, and perhaps others are. And I'm hearing of more people in the age range who now have at least the first shot, for those who are on the 2-shot regimen and so forth. So I think that will continue to improve as time marches on.
Mr. Mayor, if I may,
yes,
have a word. I think it's important to recognize that the town of Garner does not set the parameters on the vaccines. That's done probably national, state level. The equity vaccines, it's a nationwide program, and we were approached to have that event, and we'll probably be approached to have others similar to it. So I mean, the position I'm in is either I accept it the way they bring it, or I tell them we don't want it. So, that's a precarious position to be in. Like Councilmember Dellinger said, it's based on data, availability, trust, representation. There's a lot of factors, and that's the way it was presented to us. And so we accepted it, knowing that there's a pandemic. And I know I got some calls and some folks that were not happy and felt like it was discriminatory, but it's no more discriminatory than picking an age, because there's a lot of people under 65 that need it too. So, we're just going to try to do the best we can to get everybody vaccinated. And if programs come to us that benefit anybody in Garner, more than likely we're going to take it as it comes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, sir. And I think I mentioned this last week. I want to thank Rick Mercer and Adam Carroll and perhaps others for assisting me with my first sort of state of the town address. And it was nice to have them fill in and have a lot of video with that. So at any rate, that's out there in the public domain. That's where it'll be for a while. Don't plan to present that at any meeting. All of you have access to that. So it is there. I would mention, perhaps on a sad note, I think many of you, maybe all of you, know Beverly Adams, who more recently was involved over at the chamber. Before that, she worked down at the legislature for a number of years. Just a lovely, nice lady. Unfortunately, she passed away just a couple of days ago. Perhaps you're already aware of that. Her service, or a service, will be tomorrow over at the ballroom at 3:00. Unfortunately, I have a meeting tomorrow already scheduled. But at any rate, just be aware of that if you will be. Okay. I think that's all I have. So let me see.
Mr. Mayor, let me mention one item, touched on what the manager said in regards to trash pickup. The last couple of weeks, I have sent Ms. Behringer a couple of items also where legislatures are trying to get some dollars to change the way the state's cleaning up roads. But they are, and I saw them today with my own eyes, working on both Highway 64 and 264. They've been out cleaning the trash. They're also cutting some of the grass around the cables, which are god awful ugly in some communities. I also want to compliment our public works for the work they do, and also our contractors. When you drove through some of these towns and the grass is 3 feet and 4 feet high and it's been dead most of the winter and it still hadn't been cut, and then you drive through Garner and see how good Garner looks, it says a lot. And some of these are good sized towns too, that they allow that to happen. And so I appreciate the work that our folks do in trying to not only keep the trash picked up as best they can, especially in the main corridors, but you drive around to some other communities and you see how fortunate we are to keep ours looking as good as we do. So I'll just reiterate that. If you drive through the town of Zebulon, they keep their stretch extremely well kept and maintained also. That's one I can just pop off the top of my head because it's a very wide grass median. So we're fortunate for the folks we have working here in Garner at Public Works that keep our town looking good.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Singleton. I meant to recognize either one of the assistant managers if they had anything just before we adjourn. I'll recognize John Hodges. Do you have anything, John?
Mr. Mayor, the only thing I have is I've sent a link to Jeff's presentation from tonight to you all. I thought that some of the material he presented that might be useful for you to be able to look back at as a reference as we make this transition to 160D. So you should find that in your email tonight.
Good. Okay. And Mr. Roy Lance, anything else?
No, nothing else to add. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, the only thing I would add real quick is the Showcase of Talent is March 27th. Premiere starts at 2:00. So if you could take a look at that. And then the only other thing is the GPAC is also showcasing some artists, and there's an artist series. So normally they would have an art show throughout this month, but it's all virtual. So take a look at that too when you have the opportunity.
Okay. And did we mention, by the way, I can't remember, maybe we did, Mr. Dickerson, that Mr. Dickerson's own lovely wife had an art display with there. Is it still there, Rodney, or is that?
Well, it was virtual.
Okay, that's
She was
right,
part of
yeah.
the workshop. Yeah.
I
And
used
she
to
did it on
enjoy
her.
going
I didn't have anything to do with it. So
Okay. All right. Thank you. Council, anything else for the good of the group before we adjourn?
No.
Hearing none, I will entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all right. Thank you, council. If you're in favor of that, please say aye. And they all
Aye.
said aye. Thank you very much. And again, thanks for the good work you do and for the discussion this evening. You'll note the special meeting times that have already been mailed out to you, I think, for some follow-up from our council retreat. So in the meantime, stay safe, be careful, and see you at the next meeting, if not before. And a good night to you all.